Hello everyone, my name is Meenakshi and I'm a tutor with Interns for Good. Today I'll be walking you through the plant cycle. This is a quick summary of what we will be covering today. This lesson is suitable for anyone in the 5th through 6th grades. The first stage of the plant cycle is the seed stage. A seed has a tiny plant inside of it called an embryo, and a hard outer covering of the seed protects this embryo. The plant cycle begins when a seed is planted into the soil. The conditions of soil are important because if the conditions are right, meaning there's water available and appropriate nutrients, then the seed will grow into a plant. The next stage is called germination. This is when the conditions are right, the embryo will grow beyond its shell. The embryo absorbs water and it swells up, splitting the hard outer covering. Germination refers to when a small seedling or shoot comes out of the seed. The roots, stem, and beginning leaves also form in this stage. After germination happens, the plant undergoes a period of growth. The root system grows, the stem gets longer, and more leaves are formed. During this time, as the name suggests, the plant focuses all of its energy on growing and increasing its size. A major part of plant growth comes from photosynthesis. When you're young, you need food to eat and you need to stay healthy and grow. And similarly, photosynthesis is basically how a plant eats. Plants use sunlight, carbon dioxide, which is gas in the air, and water to make its own food, which are called sugars. Not like the sugar we eat, though. This process of photosynthesis happens in the leaves of plants. Leaves are the part of plants that are able to capture sunlight so that the plant can use it. Alright, that was a lot of information, so let's do some quick review. In the image you see here, what stage of the plant cycle is shown? I'll give you 5 seconds to think about it. Ready? The correct answer is seed. That was easy, wasn't it? Well, let's look at a more challenging question. Do you remember what we call the material inside of the seed? I'll give you 10 seconds this time. Ready? The correct answer is a plant embryo. Remember, embryo is basically the tiny plant inside of the seed. Let's move on. What stage of the plant cycle do you see in this image? I'll give you 5 seconds. The correct answer is germination. That was probably also easy too, right? Well, let's look at something a little more challenging. What do we call the plant that we see at this stage? I'll give you 10 seconds to remember. And the correct answer is a seedling. Now, since we are talking about the plant cycle, we have to get back to the seed stage, right? Well, after growth, the plant needs to be able to produce more plants. This process is called reproduction. Plant reproduction is when a plant makes another plant. There are two types of plant reproduction, plants that produce seeds and plants that don't. And of those plants that do produce seeds, some of them have flowers, while others don't. Flowering plants go through pollination, which we will discuss, and plants that don't produce flowers depend on dispersion to reproduce, which we will also discuss. Plants that don't produce seeds produce something else called spores instead. First, let's take a look at flowering plants. These types of plants will go through a stage called flowering. Flowering plants are called angiosperms. I like to remember this by thinking that Angie is a girl who owns a flower store, so angiosperms are plants that produce flowers. Now, angiosperms produce buds, which hold the flowers inside of them. Flowers are the reproductive part of the plant. They have the necessary parts to produce more seeds, and they are designed to attract pollinators. Now, to understand how flowers produce seeds, we need to first understand how the parts of the flower work. There are male parts and female parts on a flower. The male part of the flower includes the anther and the filament. The anther is important because it creates pollen. As a whole, these male parts are called the stamen. The female parts include the stigma, style, ovary, and ovules. The stigma is the upper part of the yellow tube in the diagram, and it's kind of sticky because it's in charge of catching the pollen. The style is the yellow tube, and it is what the pollen from the stigma travels down. The ovary consists of ovules, and it turns into the fruit that we eat, which contains seeds. The ovule is where the pollen ultimately ends up in, and it produces seeds. The whole female part is called the pistil. The other parts include the sepal, which protects and supports the flower, and the petals, which are designed to attract insects like bees. The petals can also have special scents or colors for this purpose. Wow, that was a lot of new information. If you're a bit confused, don't worry. Now is a great time to pause the video and visit the slides to access the links to review this information. There are games and even a quiz you can use to review. You can also go back to these links after the video if you're confident in your knowledge. Now that we have talked about the parts of the flower, we're ready to talk about pollination. Pollination is the process seed-producing flowering plants use to reproduce. I talked about pollen before, but in case you're unfamiliar with the term, pollen is basically a fine, powdery, and kind of sticky substance. The male part of the flower, specifically the anther, produces this pollen. Pollen also contains a male reproductive cell, which is important to make seeds. After the anther creates pollen, the pollen is picked up by a pollinator. A pollinator is anything that moves pollen, like a bee or a butterfly or even a bird. Pollinators are attracted to the flowers, as I mentioned before. The reason why is because the flowers produce a substance called nectar. Pollinators love eating nectar, and some depend on nectar to survive. So, a pollinator will stop on a flower to drink its nectar. When it does this, the pollen from the anther gets onto them. For example, bees are great pollinators because they're fuzzy, so pollen sticks to their bodies. The next step is for the pollinator to go to another flower. When the pollinator does this, the pollen on its body will go to the stigma, or the female part of the flower. The other flower is going to capture this pollen, and it will go to the ovary, where the seeds are made. Finally, the ovary is going to turn into a fruit so that it can hold these seeds. Once these seeds are removed and planted, the cycle starts again. That was a bit complicated, so let's take a look at this diagram. Here we can see a bee, which is a pollinator, eating nectar from a flower. Its body is big enough that it rubs against the anther, or the male part of the flower that has pollen. Because of this, the pollen is going to stick to the bee's body. When the bee goes to another flower, the pollen from the previous flower is transferred to the stigma, or the female part of the flower. This pollen transfer results in seeds being created. Here's a better image of what that looks like. On the left, you can see the pollen from one flower attaches to the bee, then transfers to the other flower. In the right, there is a flower that is self-pollinating, which means that the pollen is just falling from the anther into the stigma. If you're feeling a little lost, take a moment to pause this video and watch the video linked onto the slides. If you're ready to move on, let's take a look at what happens after reproduction for seed-producing flowering plants happens. Dispersion is the final step. When you hear the word disperse, think of the word scatter, because that's basically what dispersion is. Outside forces like wind, human activity like farming, and even animals that eat fruits but don't digest the seeds, scatter the seeds and put them back into the ground, where the cycle begins again. Well, what about plants that don't flower? Well, first of all, plants that don't flower but do produce seeds are called gymnosperms. I like to remember that gym doesn't like flowers, so gymnosperms don't produce flowers. The seeds of gymnosperms grow on the outside of the plant. Instead, they grow in cones, like pine cones. There are male and female cones. Things like animals or wind transfer the light pollen from the male cones to the female cones, which then produce seeds. The seeds are carried by the wind and fall to the ground, where they go back to the seed stage. Plants that don't flower and don't produce seeds produce spores. Spores are tiny microscopic living things, or organisms. They are so small and light that the wind carries them to other places where, in the right conditions, they grow into a new plant. The two main groups of plants that produce spores are moss and fern. Now is a good time to watch this video, which has a full recap of everything we went over if you're feeling a little unsure. Let's review everything we talked about with a short quiz. Which of the following describes an angiosperm? A. A tree, B. A sunflower, C. Grass, or D. Moss? I'll give you 10 seconds for each question. The correct answer is B. A sunflower. Remember, angiosperms are plants that produce flowers. Therefore, a sunflower is an angiosperm. Next question. Which of the following produces spores? A. A tree, B. A sunflower, C. Grass, or D. Moss? The correct answer is D. Moss. Quick, name each stage of the plant cycle in order. The correct order is seed, germination, growth, reproduction, and finally dispersion. What types of plants pollinate? This is open-ended, so I'll give you 15 seconds. The correct answer is flowering plants, or angiosperms. So what happens during pollination? Write down your answer and I'll give you 20 seconds. Your answer should be related to how pollinators transfer pollen from the stamen or anther from one flower to the pistil or stigma of another. You can also talk about self-pollination. Alright, last question. Take 15 seconds to match each stage with the description of the stage. Alright, this could be a little tricky if you don't read closely. During germination, the roots, stem, and leaves form. During growth, the roots, stem, and leaves grow. During dispersion, the seeds are scattered by the wind. Since this is a cycle, here's a better image to really understand how the plant cycle works. Take a moment to just look at how the seed evolves to be a plant and how the plant continues this cycle by producing seeds. Great job! You've made it to the end. There are several activities you can do now if you want to review everything we just went over. You can click on the petals of the flowers or the leaves to access review games, which go over everything we learned today. You can also listen to a song or even look at a bigger list with way more activities listed. Thank you for watching, and I hope this was helpful for you.